And okay, we're live. Okay. Welcome everyone to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. Sorry for the delay, a little YouTube issue there. But we're live now, and I'm very happy that we have our special guest, Keri Browder of Prime Coalition. I've actually known Keri for about 3 years, and I've been a volunteer at Prime Coalition for about 10 years, since the beginning of Prime Coalition. And Keri leads Project Frame, which we're going to talk about, and I've been a volunteer for that for 3 years. So we've actually been working together, and which has been great. Keri's been doing a great job, and she's the perfect person to tell us about Prime Coalition and what Project Frame is. What we're going to do is get into a discussion of how can investors evaluate the climate impact of climate solution companies so you can make sure you're making a good investment. But before we get into all of that, first I'd like to start with Keri and welcome you and ask you to give us a brief biography of your background.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. I'm really excited to be here and to engage with everyone. As Dan said, my name is Keri Browder, and I am the Director of Impact Accountability and Project Frame at Prime Coalition. And I am based just out of DC in Annapolis. My background is not in climate specifically. I actually got both my undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science and found myself working in international development, where I got to support a lot of finance projects, scaling mostly waste management solutions in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. And then I got a graduate certificate in social finance from Oxford. And before Prime, I worked at Conservancy, focused on scaling waste management systems in order to prevent plastic waste from entering the ocean. I've been with Prime for, as Dan said, almost 3 years now, which is kind of wild. And I lead something called our influencing strategy or influencing capital strategy. So when we talk a little bit more about Prime, I'll go through each of the strategies and then we'll drill down on Project Frame.
Oh, that's great. So, well, actually, it would be great since I think most people, by the way, links are in the description for both Prime Coalition as well as Project Frame. So if you really want to get into the details, and we're going to be talking about this methodology today, which is actually available at the Project Frame website, so you can actually read all the details if you'd like to. But why don't you start off and tell us a little bit, what is Prime Coalition?
Yes, thank you so much. So Prime Coalition is a 501c3. So we are a nonprofit catalytic investor. And we envision a world in which humanity thrives without the threat of climate change. And we do that through 2 strategies. One is called steering capital, in which we invest directly into companies through one of our investment programs. We first started through syndication, then we launched Prime Impact Fund, Azola Ventures, and recently launched Trellis Climate, which is more for project finance. And then we have an influencing capital strategy, which is about building the ecosystem for spreading the education and upskilling for catalytic capital, but also upskilling investors in what we call impact accountability. And we do that through 2 methods. One is building community through Project Frame, which aims at building common terminology and best practices for forward-looking emissions assessment and reporting. And then the Crane tool, which is a free online software tool that actually operationalizes the Project Frame methodology and allows people to do forward-looking emissions assessment with a few clicks if you are unable to do the more detailed work by yourself or with a small team.
Right. So yeah, Crane is like this modeling tool. You talk about what your business does and what your emissions are, and or the potential emissions or reduction in emissions, and it gives you does a lot of the math for you and gives you some responses, right? Yeah, and again, that's not that you can find that through the Prime Coalition. I don't think we have a direct link to Crane, but I think through Prime Coalition
it should be on the website. And if not, if there's any sort of follow-up, I can make sure I can give a slew of resources and links for anyone who wants to peek around.
Right. So what you're trying to do is let people who want to sort of donate money, philanthropic capital, sort of be more effective in addressing climate change by taking on more riskier investments, right? You just
Absolutely.
have regular capital, people just want the return on the money and they don't care so much about what it is. But in this case, you can do things that other investors can't do.
So I don't believe it's mutually exclusive. I would say that Prime existed because we saw that there was a gap in the marketplace when we were created 10 years ago by my boss, our executive, Sarah Carney. She was doing her master's thesis at MIT and was trying to figure out why sort of grantors and investors for family offices weren't speaking to each other. And she came across this guidance in the tax code that basically said, if you could prove a charitable purpose, you could invest in for-profit companies. Now, there is a huge challenge that we have in the climate space, and that is there really aren't enough technologies in the pipeline yet that can scale to help us meet our climate objectives. So at Prime, we would like to see gigaton scale impact by 2050. A lot of these really high potential companies, because they are so risky, weren't receiving mainstream investment. So we use this catalytic capital model that says, if you are willing to invest at higher risk and understand that you might not have the market rate returns or the returns that you would have with a mainstream investor, but you really want to see the impact, we would like to talk to you. And so since inception, we've actually mobilized over $315 million in catalytic capital and have worked with over 90 first-time catalytic investors. So we do think the market is shifting, that people are getting educated and realize that this can be a tool in one's toolbox from a philanthropic perspective, but also just changing the marketplace and the way people think about investing in climate.
And I think also because these investments can actually make money.
Eventually, it is possible.
Eventually. So you've actually created Azola Ventures, which is sort of a profit. It's like a VC that is following the directions of Prime to be sort of more aggressive in terms of riskier profiles of climate solution that have bigger upside, but maybe they're too risky for a regular VC to invest in. So that's called Azola. And then there's Prime Coalition. And you mentioned Crane. But now there's also something called, Crane. And there's also something called Project Frame, which you're leading.
Under the influencing capital strategy, which is separate. So we don't do... Yeah, so we don't do direct investments in the influencing capital strategy. It's more to help serve our nonprofit mission to build the fields around us and reduce the barrier of entry for climate investing. Our personal goal is that any investor should be able to be a climate investor. It shouldn't be this siloed group. It should be mainstream. And what we hear when we've done research or spoken to the community is that there's this perception that it's overly cumbersome or complicated. And the truth is, it can be the same part as any due diligence process. And so we are just working to educate people and provide the resources to make it easier so mainstream investors don't have the excuse that it's too complicated to get it done. We will show you how to do it. And so Project Frame started a little over 3 years ago, which was with a group of small climate-focused investors that said, why are we all working separately? Let's come together to figure out what we feel are best practices, because there isn't any regulation or guidance for what we call forward-looking emissions assessment. There are a lot of groups out there that do footprinting, which is a lot of it is backwards looking and then trying to figure out how to reconcile that. We aren't so much focused on the past. We're focused on enabling investors to make smarter decisions with their money today. So pre-investment diligence is really our wheelhouse. And then we're sort of breaking into then the impact monitoring and management and reporting after the fact to sort of what we'll be doing next.
Right. And you actually have a lot of, well, let's call them climate investors who are the ones helping you. And also, but it's also for them too, because rather than every separate investor coming up with their own methodology for how to evaluate a company, you sort of give them a common methodology. They can, adjust it to their needs. But so it just makes it easier for everyone. And then
they're speaking the same language. which is really important.
That's also very important.
Mm.
And also regular investors not investing in climate, maybe they thought, well, it's too hard to figure out how to pick them or something. This is something they can also use just to make it easier for them to invest in this obviously very important area of investment.
So I get very excited when I see we have these bi-monthly open to the public community meetings where we have investors present or we talk about a specific topic. And I get really excited when I see who is signing up to listen in, because more and more I am seeing mainstream investors and institutional investors. Like, I won't name any names, but like people who represent banks and their funds. And so when I see that they're starting to pay attention to this, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. So it gives me some hope.
And do you have some statistics on how many investors are officially part of Project Frame? Or?
So when we started, I think we were under 100 investors, but probably about 200 people total. Now, as of June, we are over 900 observing members,
Wow.
which represent over 360 investment firms. And of those that identify as venture capital or private equity, so we took out the banks, we have around 670 billion in assets under management. So we take our responsibility very seriously, and are really fortified by seeing that the interest has been growing so rapidly in this work.
Wow, that's great, by the way. And
thank you.
Keri, you've been doing a great job. And I've been part of this as one of the folks helping to, write the methodologies and focus on particular areas. So why don't you, first of all, just tell us at the high level, super high level, because again, anyone interested in reading methodology, they can go to Project Frame and read the document. But what are sort of the basics of evaluating a company for climate impact?
Correct. So what we talk about forward-looking impact. I'm going to repeat that multiple times because I think it's really important to have people understand. So we are trying to actually evaluate or forecast what the impact of a company could be if it were to scale in the future. And there are two ways of doing this forward-looking impact. We call it planned and potential. Potential impact is the unit impact of the company or the technology that you're talking about against what the incumbent would be if an incumbent exists. So it's an efficiency question, and I'll get into efficiency in a bit, times what is the total addressable market. So it could be quite large, what the impact could be if it were to scale. Whereas planned impact is actually tied to a realistic business model. The reason why we distinguish between the two is because the reality for most venture investors when you're early stage, so pre-seed through Series A, is that you might not have actually created and deployed the technology yet. So it's really hard to drill down on both what the unit impact could be and what the market is, because also you have novice entrepreneurs who are still figuring out what their business plan is. We still believe that with a good idea and with the science to back it up, that they are investable projects and deserve even more capital and attention sometimes than status quo technologies. Planned impact is really important because it checks those assumptions. So you've invested, there's now a business model. Now let's be more realistic about what you think the impact would be if it were to scale.
Okay. So now we're going to get into a little more of the controversial areas. But what are, in terms of the basics, you mentioned, so you have a unit impact and you're multiplying it times.
We'll say volume. So that's the major thing is unit impact times a volume is GHG impact. If you have been following our work or are interested in following our work closely, we will have an update to the methodology public shortly, where we say after you have that metric, you can then add on what we call adjustment factors. And so adjustment factors could include things like rebound effect, different types of attribution, if attribution is important to you as an investor or your LPs. So we have, there are different ways to describe it, but ones are across the value chain versus those who are part of the investor or asset class. and how much you have invested. But those are some of the more, I think, still critical aspects of understanding your impact, but definitely more controversial since there doesn't seem to be consensus yet on what are best
Mhm.
practices in those arenas.
But just to give it like some solid examples, we
Mhm.
sometimes just talk about EVs as an
Yeah.
easy way to
Mhm.
think about it. So you're talking about unit impact, and we're just these are going to be made up numbers. These are not actual numbers from EVs.
Yeah.
But if a gas car emits X, let's say 10,000 tons over its lifetime, it's actually
Mhm.
more than that. But and an EV does 5, the
Mhm.
unit impact is 5,000 tons, like that's how much less it will emit. And then you multiply times the number of units. Let's say if you're going to sell it,
Whatever
you
the
think you'll
volumes
sell
are
a
that you
million
think
of
you'll
it.
sell. Yep.
Right. So that would be 5,000, 5 million, 5 billion times. I don't think it would be that much, but okay, it could be. Oh, yeah. And it's over what time frame?
And over a
And
specific time frame. Like that is
right,
always
right.
very important to clarify
Mm-hmm.
because you do have, unfortunately, some, I won't say bad actors, but actors that are a bit more ambiguous about where their numbers come from. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really important to check the time frame because if someone's saying like, this is what we think we could accomplish 150 years from now, and really our climate targets are much more urgent and need to be in the next, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, like those are assumptions that really need to be checked.
Right.
Mhm.
Absolutely. A very key point, by the way. And so you always want to ask if someone tells you we're going to save a gigaton, okay,
By when?
over what? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how much? How much in the next 10 years,
Mhm.
right? How much in the next 20? How much in 30? If it's out 100 years, then I
And
probably
Prime,
should ignore it altogether.
since Prime is an early stage investor, this is something that we do in our own work through our steering capital
Mm-hmm.
strategy. And 2050 is the cutoff for us because we invest in such early stage companies.
So let's dig into. So again, the basic idea is the new solution either emits less than the incumbent solution,
Mhm.
and you look at the difference times the volume of how many you think you'll sell over what time frame. It also, by the way, maybe you have a negative emission technology, and you account for that as well, like carbon
Correct.
capture. But
Mhm.
that's sort of the basics. But it gets a little more interesting. And we
Mhm.
covered some of these issues here on Climate Chat, actually, even just a few weeks ago, where we talked about the rebound effect. But let's talk first about the baseline, because for the EV example, you're saying the emissions of the EV versus an ICE car, an internal combustion engine car, that you're saying it will replace. And so the baseline is that ICE car, and I would call that a relative baseline.
Mhm.
It's
Yep.
your EV is still emitting something, but it's
Correct.
emitting less, and you care about how much less. So talk a little bit about baselines, and maybe we'll like jump into that a little bit. I'll make a suggestion on other baselines you can use,
Sure, of course.
or I'll let you do
So
that.
I think as an entry point, so one thing that is interesting about those who come to Project Frame, they come from all different levels of understanding and experience. And so my philosophy is always something is better than nothing. So I do want to start there. The fact that people are trying to figure this out is critically important. But I would say the whole idea of what we call a static baseline, so you just assume that the baseline will stay the same into the future is probably the most entry level assumption because it's just not, we all know it's just categorically not true. There will not be the same amount of cars. There could be, as I'm sure we'll talk about, probably more consumers as things get more efficient. And so the baseline changes. So at Project Frame, currently we recommend what we call a dynamic baseline, or you try to attempt to have a dynamic baseline where you adjust based on these different assumptions on growing or shrinking markets in the future. Now, there's another type of baseline, which I don't think we codified and shared publicly, but I know we've discussed, Dan, which is the idea of a zero emissions baseline, which is like, well, you're comparing against an ICE car, but what if you were comparing against nothing? Like what if
Or a
what was the
bicycle, a
world or
bicycle.
a bicycle? Well, like, yeah,
Yeah.
what was the world like before the ICE car even existed? How much better or worse is that? And obviously, a even the most efficient vehicle on the market that I know of is definitely worse than a bicycle or taking public transportation. So those are things that you need to take into account. And I also think really important for educating consumers as well, because I think the average consumer doesn't really think that way unless they have like sustainability in their heart, and not
Right.
everyone is like us in how they try to scrutinize their buying power. And I hope we can start to enable people to do that more too.
Right. And an example for ICE cars is that in China, I think a couple years ago at this point, the number one selling EV costs $5,000. And actually, really good cars now cost 10. And you say, wow, at $5,000, you're going to get a lot of people driving ICE cars to switch to EVs. And that's true. They're already, the new car sales are above 50% EV
Yep.
in China today, and that's the largest car market in the world. But when you have a $5,000 EV that's selling well, you could also imagine a bunch of people riding bicycles switching to EVs. And when that happens, you've actually increased emissions. So you can't just look at the savings between the
And
ICE car
traffic.
and the EV, and increase traffic, which also increases everyone's emissions. And so you have to look at all of those factors. And of course, you can't model it down, to a 0.1% kind of thing, but you can look at sort of broad trends and things. And
And I think
that's a
that
little bit of a rebound effect, by the way. Very low cost cars mean they're cheaper, so more people use them. So even though you've reduced per car, you end up with many more cars, and that counters it. So that you have to take all these factors into account.
And I think that's what's so great about the Project Frame community, and especially these content working groups. It's sort of having these conversations and sussing out the different types of, we call like different types of impacts or effects that you could have. And I'd like to think it's a safe space for people to scrutinize their own assumptions, so you are more thoughtful about all the investments you make in the future and continue to improve.
So we're talking a little bit about baseline. I don't know there's another subject, but maybe we'll go back to rebound. We talked a little bit about rebound, but additionality is a very key point in not only what investors, but also in the whole carbon credit market, for example, whether what you're doing is actually doing what you say. Can you tell us a little bit about additionality?
Yeah, absolutely. So additionality is, if not the first, the second most hotly contested topic in the Project Frame community. I will say we have a section on additionality in the methodology if people want to get into detail. But what we recommend in Project Frame is actually to provide your definition of additionality, because the way it is defined in carbon markets, and for instance, the way we define it at Prime Coalition, are very different. And so for Prime, additionality is critical to every investment that we make and every fund that we build. But we are we go through a very rigorous process and even have multiple committees that basically tell us whether or not the technology we want to invest in is additional. Is it new? Like, for instance, we wouldn't invest in an EV car. Like, to us, that is not being additional to the marketplace at this point in time. However, if there was a way to improve, for instance, the way we, like the mining process for the materials that we need, and to make that much more efficient because it is so carbon intensive to extract certain minerals, then that is something we would be interested in, because those types of investments aren't happening much yet. So we invested in a company called Lilac Solutions that actually makes the extraction process for lithium much more energy efficient than the status quo in the past. But to get to it, and what we talk about in the Frame community, so many investors think about additionality differently and what is considered additional. And a lot of times what I find is that many investors define additionality as what is their value add as an early stage investor. So they believe that if, you're just coming in early and you're willing to work with these entrepreneurs, that is how you are being additional to the investment. That is very different than what we
very
are
different.
talking about. So,
same word used, two totally different
same
concepts.
word used totally different ways. And I think that can be very confusing for the investors, but also I imagine in the future for the regulators, if we do end up in a world where carbon markets are really expanding or governments are getting involved in deciding what can be considered catalytic, that if they really start to scrutinize that, additionality and the way one defines additionality will be really important. So at Frame, what we're doing right now, we haven't released this yet, but release it soon, is a framework for how to help investors describe what they think is additional and why. And so once again, just providing a framework and some common terminology is, I think, critically important to weeding out bad actors, but also enabling good investors to really articulate their value.
Yeah. So, yeah, and another example I think is also solar and wind, where it used to be they were more expensive than fossil fuels. So if you implemented them, you got credit as being additional because other people wouldn't normally do that because they were too expensive. But right now they're the cheapest form of energy, and 90%
is that really additional? Some would still say yes, because it's still not, unless you're in like California, there still needs to be some feel that solar and wind still needs to expand to upset fossil fuels. So some will make the argument that it's additional, but others would say to the contrary.
Right. Although, I mean, nowadays, 90% of all new electricity generation is renewable just because they're cheaper. Now, yeah. I think this is interesting. I think we're not going to get into this too much detail here, but I think that if you could show that your renewables are actually replacing fossil fuels as opposed to adding to the energy supply, which almost 100% of the renewables so far have only added to energy supply. It has not lowered fossil fuel use. In particular countries, you can argue that, but overall in the world, renewables have just increased energy supply. If you can somehow have a new kind of design or business model or something that directly, shuts down a fossil fuel and sticks in a renewable, I bet you could argue for additionality much more easily in that case. But that's probably a whole hour discussion. We never got into that. So let's go to another one, which we only touched on a little bit, but I think a super important one, and one I worked on a bit and just did a whole show on, and that's the rebound effect. And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit, what is the rebound effect and how is it covered in Project Frame?
So the rebound effect is something that we just started discussing in more detail this past year. We haven't gone much into releasing too much publicly outside of a couple of community meetings, but it's the whole idea that if you put something out into the world, there is a chance that it could have all of these effects that work against your original intention, which is lowering, in our case, lowering GHG emissions. So you gave the example earlier of making inexpensive but still energy efficient cars in China. So an unfortunate rebound effect was then people who were using bikes were then buying these cars, and you have the opposite effect that you would want to have as far as lowering emissions, because you expanded the market. You didn't just lower emissions for the market that already existed for ICE vehicles. And so we won't get into too much detail on the different numbers we would attach to different types of rebound effects, but in the updated methodology, we will have a list of, based on what your market is or what you are trying to accomplish, what you can anticipate the rebound effect could be based on what we've seen with other types of technologies. And so you won't be able to claim the same amount of impact that you were before, because we know in reality, reality is much different than the intention.
I think this is an area, by the way, it's a very important area and one that it's like overlooked a lot. when people are looking at climate impact of potential solutions. By the way, the original one that was studied was coal. So coal was used and burned to, to get industrial processes going. But James Watt came along and made a more efficient steam engine that, you could use a third less coal, or two-thirds less coal, I think, for a particular application. And so you would think, coal use is going to drop now because every application only needs one-third as much. And what happened, of course, is coal use soared, and we had the Industrial Revolution, and we got climate change because of that particular rebound effect, which was more than 100%. In other words, your increase in efficiency was more than offset with the total increase in energy use. And when that happens, it's called Jevons paradox, or it's also called backfire when that happens. And so that case, it was way more than 100%. I know I'm looking actually at a company right now. I won't get into the details, but it's just an improvement in efficiency of computing. And there's a lot of stuff like in that area. That's one where I think the rebound effect is way over 100%. I mean, computing efficiency has gone up a millionfold or more, literally a millionfold or more in the last 30 years. And when you see what happens is energy use of computing is skyrocketing.
And then you need all of these storage facilities and everything that are actually very energy intensive. And
Right. So you say, oh, wait, those are energy intensive. I got a good idea. Here's this thing you can do to lower the energy use of a data center. And there's lots of things out there and involved in some companies in this area. But what happens is you lower the cost of computing because it needs less energy. And now you can use data centers for tying your shoes and doing things you never would have thought of doing if computing was expensive. And so that's again, the rebound effect. I think it's a much bigger effect. And as we talked about on my show a few months ago, there are cases where it's actually more than 100%. Lighting appears to be one that in the long run is more than 100%, even though an LED bulb uses 80% less electricity. And in your house, you will lower your bill. But overall, you see a lot more lights everywhere now. There's the Sphere in Las Vegas, which just lights everywhere. So, okay, so that's rebound, and that's a really important one. And I have to give Project Frame credit for even taking this on, because it's one people would kind of like to overlook because it makes your climate impact not as good as it would if you didn't take this.
That's true. I think a lot of very well-intentioned truly very well-intentioned investors, without being forced to really think through these things, you could end up making an investment that could scale rapidly, but will have no climate impact, or worse, harm. And I truly believe that I would say almost everyone who comes to Frame, we can get into motivations later, really does want to make sure that they're investing things that they can be proud of from a climate perspective. But I don't think everyone's going to get it right all the time. But the importance of this community, and with the lack of standards that are currently out there or regulations, is we need to pressure each other to be better. We need to hold each other and ourselves more accountable.
Okay. And as you mentioned, rebound is covered a little bit in the current version, but there's going to be more in an upcoming
more
version.
Detail. So. Hopefully by the end of the year.
Okay.
By the end of the year, you can let your community know.
Look at the document. There's a methodology.
Yeah, there's some in the current document, and if you look at previous community meetings where we discuss case studies, or what we call investor profiles, you'll hear more and more that people are mentioning this in their own practice, and it's because of the conversations we're having in Project Frame.
Yeah. Okay. So again, link in the description to Project Frame and Prime Coalition, but go to Project Frame, find the methodology. It's available for download. You could read it. You can use it. It's really meant for everyone who's interested in investing in climate solutions that we need. Even though there's a lot going on now, I must say, it's in the last few years, climate, focus on climate investing has increased as damage from climate change has increased. But we need a lot more. And we also need policy, of course, as well to drive investment. But anyway, so that's great. You actually mentioned something I'd like to hear from you, and that is, what do you think the motivation of your investors, people getting involved in Prime and Project Frame, Are they motivated by purely by money, or what
That's a
drives them to
very that's a
use your
very good question.
materials?
So I'm going to distinguish between motivations for those who come to Prime versus motivations for those who come to Project Frame. I would
Okay.
say for those who come to Prime, like I said, we work in a catalytic space, so I think very close to everyone who comes to invest with Prime is driven primarily by the impact they're trying to make. But I do not have stats behind that. Whereas the Project Frame community, we have asked them every year, we do an annual survey and we ask them about their motivations. First is always concern for the planet, but what is really interesting is that second is firm competitiveness. And
Ooh.
third is regulation or anticipation of regulation. So I do think that, and just so you know the makeup, I would say 90% of the investors who come to Frame are looking for market or above market rate returns. So that's also different from from Prime as a catalytic investor. And a lot of that people forget is fiduciary responsibility. So I try to I always take that with a grain of salt because some have requirements by law to try to make as much money as possible for their clients.
Mm. Hmm.
But
Hmm.
the motivations are interesting because I think for many, even though you might have individuals who work on this who are very passionate about climate change, what is shifting in the culture, which I think is probably a good thing, is that now there's a growing expectation from those who are giving money to investors that they should be able to figure this out. And they want to prove that they are well versed enough that those who are giving them their money, whether it's an LP or a philanthropist, that they can say, this is how I am going to think about climate impact. I have a methodology, I'm part of a community. So you should trust me with your capital. And I think it, it is both a good and a bad thing. Like I wish everyone just wanted to join us for the pure like love of wanting to save the planet. But the truth is, and we only have like 20 minutes left, so I don't know if you want to discuss capitalism for the next 20 minutes, but we do live in a capitalistic society. And so I do think that that is a big motivating factor for why this is getting more competitive.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's interesting. Yeah, well, that's an interesting set of motivations. What before we get to questions from others, what what are you looking forward to in the work you're doing? What makes you optimistic about what you're working on? What do you think the future holds at Frame and Prime?
Sure. So, generally, I would say what keeps me motivated in both is the increased in interest. So I feel like we're doing something right. I think Dan, you and I are like-minded in that we are in this work because we are passionate about it. And even though it can be very daunting, it always gives me hope or adds fuel to my fire when I see that so many people are like, how do I get more involved? How can I be better? I think that's a really good sign and not just people
Hmm.
like throwing their hands and giving up or being like, that's not the way we've done it in the past. I don't care about changing. Like I do think my day to day is filled with people who are curious and who want to be better. And I find that personally very motivating. For Prime, I'm very excited about our new Trellis fund. We are
Hmm.
investing in project finance, which is new for us. Before we were very early stage venture. We've made two investments so far in two companies. One is called Ebb Carbon and one is called Ample Carbon. And one actually retrofits decommissioned coal plants for carbon capture and storage, which is really interesting. And the other actually uses marine carbon dioxide removal. And the way we're being catalytic is basically providing the financing for the studies that they need to do to basically make sure that there are no other environmental or social detriments before we can really scale these technologies. But
Hmm.
they're so cool that that gives me a lot of hope.
Hey,
And
by the way, can you just for everyone out in the audience who might not be as familiar with the lingo, what's the difference between venture capital and project finance?
Okay, sure. So, and maybe you might have to correct me on this, but
Okay.
when I think about venture capital versus project finance, it has to do with the maturity of the company. So, venture capital is at the earliest stages. For us, we're talking about things that are innovations. And then initially, when we invested in Prime Impact Fund and Azola, that was that early research and development, prototyping, proof of concept, what we call pre-seed to seed Series A stage. And then after you have a pilot and a demonstration, you get into this commercialization piece.
Hmm.
And that is where project finance fits. So you haven't truly commercialized yet, but you have a pilot, you actually have a thing that works that you want to demonstrate out in the field. And so that's before you get into like private equity. So that's where I think about it, sort of after venture, but before sort of
Hmm.
mainstream private equity sort of money. Did I do
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah. I would say also venture capital is really to help develop the technology in the early stages.
Yep.
Private equity can also be used to grow the company where the people get shares in the company, but at a
Yep.
later stage. And project finance is when people come in to fund a particular project, usually getting a share of the revenues from the project as opposed to getting ownership in the
Yep.
company.
Mhm.
Although, like anything's open game, you can kind of structure it anyway. But in the general, a project finance, it might be we're going to build this huge solar farm, with batteries and everything like that, and we're going to finance that. Or in this case, we're going to go to a particular coal mine, decommission it, install some carbon capture. You're not like developing the carbon capture. I mean, you have it ready to go, but you need $100 million or something to
So I was going to say
to
the
do that
investment
particular
sizes
project.
are significantly different.
Yeah,
So
much
before you're
bigger.
talking about investing hundreds of $1,000s, maybe a couple $1 million, when you're talking about project finances, you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and yeah, very good. So I think that's helpful to folks. Let's see.
Can
We
I
don't
say
have a
what
lot
I'm
of time.
excited about with Project Frame? I only talked
Oh
about
yeah,
Prime.
please go ahead.
So for Project Frame, I'm very excited. We just started this year's content working groups, and we have two. And the reason why I'm so excited is one of them is primarily based or made up of Asia-based investors, and they're going to
Mhm.
be working on case studies, applying the methodology, but at the same time providing us some guidance on how we should think about adaptation and resilience when in investing in climate change or climate tech solutions. And I think that will be really cool. And the second content working group is in close collaboration with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So they work with like multinational companies, and they're very focused on the concept of avoided emissions. And so we're going to be working together over the next year to say, based on your maturity and where you're investing, or if you're an investor or a company, what methodology and what best practices make sense for you. And I think that'll be a really important discussion, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of those two groups this year.
Good. I'm looking forward to helping out a bit in
Thank
one
you.
of those. Yeah, and let's open it up to Stacy. Welcome, Stacy, our co-mod, to see what questions she has, or if she's seen questions online.
Yeah, hi, thank
Hey,
you. And
thank you.
so, well, the one thing that occurred is when earlier when you were talking about additionality, and this may be a naive question, but this is just a virtue. There's nothing that they're gaining, in terms
Oh,
of, oh, they're eligible for other, public funding or something like that. It's just for virtue
no, not
reasons.
necessarily. So, Prime Coalition, we are a nonprofit, but we invest in for-profit companies. And so we actually have to prove our definition of additionality for all of our companies in order to maintain our tax exempt status in the US government's eyes. So we go through a very rigorous process to prove additionality, and it's very well documented. And then also with carbon accounting, like I said, if you are filing for carbon accounting and you claim additionality, I do believe that there is a process for that as well. In theory, most are not held to any sort of government scrutiny. So I would agree it's much more of philosophy rather than anything that is regulatory. But in our case as Prime, it absolutely is tied to maintaining our nonprofit status.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And the
And
other
the
is
the
go ahead.
additionality you mentioned is a slightly different additionality because I'm part of that group that helps determine it. And that is, would another VC invest in this anyway? So is Prime being additional in its investment? So it's slightly different type of addition. There's all kinds of additionality, I guess. So, but yeah. So yeah, go ahead, Stacy.
Well, I guess the other thing that is perplexing is it gets to the capitalism. I mean, how because we have consumed so much, because we have just this boundless and gorging ourselves on all of the things of the earth. This is why we're in the situation that we are. And so it's hard to imagine how that structure and growth and that kind can sort of help get us out of the mess we're in. And so I don't know if that is a massive question or a very simple one that you have some examples to give, but it would help because, yeah, we've dug a very large hole.
So I love this question, and I would be happy to come back and talk about this for an hour. I believe that it is what you're saying is true. Like we have gotten ourselves into this massive hole because, and we could talk about like, is commercialism and capitalism the same thing? But like the idea is we've globally, the majority of people are using things to excess and buying and consuming things unnecessarily, and we're wasting a ton. And so a couple of really great things that I think are out there are on the policy side. So if you think about the European reuse laws that are going into effect, I don't think they're like as ambitious as they could be, but like it's starting. Or the EU right to reuse, like how can you actually incentivize people to reuse things or get them repaired? Or I'm sorry, it's right to repair, not right to reuse. How do you incentivize repairing things rather than chucking something in its entirety, having it put in a landfill, and then buying something new? I think those are great concepts. There are really cool investors out there that are focused on investing in the circular economy. I call myself a circular economy evangelist. I wish we could do more of it. But all of that to be said, it is not enough fast enough. We do need a cultural shift. And it gave me a little bit of hope when during COVID we saw our emissions go down. I don't know about you, people were much kinder to their neighbors. You were much more thoughtful about what you ate and what you used so you didn't waste. And so I do think it is possible to create that reality in the future. But hopefully we can find a way to do it that doesn't involve disease or, that would be nice. But I do think it's part culture and part policy to make that possible.
And I'll add that if you do pick the right baseline, if you have the right baseline,
baselines are always important.
The zero emissions baseline shows you what all these new technologies, not how much they save, but how much they emit. Unless they're negative emissions, and then they actually have negative emissions. So even an EV, rather than being a 5,000, let's say, ton savings, you see it as a 5,000 ton add, and then you're really striving to get everything to zero, and that's a goal that we have to meet. So there are ways, even with this methodology, to kind of look at things through the right lens of how much are you emitting versus how much are you saving. And that's that's one of the controversial subjects, actually. Yeah. Anything from YouTube, Stacy? Or I see there's some here in the Zoom chat.
Doug had asked ballpark on annual growth rate for a $10,000 investment over the next decade. He's 77.
Like Zola return on investment, do they have any public numbers on that?
So we don't have any, since we invest so early, we don't have any public numbers for Prime yet. And I would say for Prime, like I said, we're 360 different investors. So I couldn't say specifically for that either. But ultimately, if you're talking about investing with catalytic capital, which is what Prime does, we are not motivated by the return. if you are ultimately looking to make money or get a return on your investment, you'd probably want to look into some of the other, you can find plenty of them on Frame's website, but there are other investors that are looking for market rate returns or above. And so you can seek them out there, but they're two different investment philosophies.
So there's a question here in the chat about the rebound. Does that mean purely tech solutions will nearly never address climate change without policy changes? And I think that, I mean, you can answer that. I have some thoughts on that too. They're basically saying, does the rebound effect always wipe out anything you do? If all you're doing is tech improvements, basically, in a system.
It'll be, you want to go first, Dan? No.
Well, yeah, I'd say that it's not. There are things that there's things, for example, that have fixed market size where just because if you cut all the refrigerators, if everyone has a refrigerator and you cut energy use in half, it's not like there'll be a few extra refrigerators around, I guess, but certainly not enough to make up for the savings. I think the opposite side is computation. When you lower the cost of computation, it goes up 10x from the, whatever savings you thought you had. So I think it depends what it is, what are the market conditions, and of course, as the question implies, if it comes through policy, then you don't have this problem. In other words, if people are making the use of carbon-based fuels more efficient because there's a price on carbon, then the carbon is sort of increasing the price and the efficiency is getting it back to where it used to be rather than dropping the price, right? So yes, you can control it with policy, but not all solutions have this problem, and it depends on many factors. And that's what, if you're doing a good job on your evaluation, you're looking at all those factors, and Project Frame can help you think about what factors you should be considering.
I agree. It also matters on the technology. I'll give two examples that I'm really excited about that I believe to scale will, no matter what, be good for the planet. And one of them, I think I can say the company specifically. It's called Gradient, but basically it's an HVAC technology, and it actually captures carbon. But when it pulls air in, but it also doesn't use refrigerants, which are terrible for the climate, it uses heat pump technology. So not only is the way when you operate it, is it emitting and creating less GHG emissions, but also it is literally pulling emissions from the air at the same time. So as it is going to scale, it could massively reduce emissions and also address something that an adaptation concern that we're all going to deal with. And that's just like, there will be more need for air conditioning units as the world gets warmer. And so if we know we're going to need more air conditioning units, like, let's try to cut out refrigerants as much as possible, because it just puts us in this vicious cycle of, as we get warmer, we're going to end up using more chemicals that will just increase the warming faster. So that's terrifying. Let's nip that in the bud. So that's a really cool technology. And then the second, I do not know the name of this company. It's not part of our portfolio, but in my previous life, pre-Prime, I went and visited an industrial composting plant in Chile, and they were doing so much cool stuff by taking like industry waste. I mean, like, this is what we pull from to then promote the grape growing industry for wine, and this is for blueberries. So they could literally figure out what waste they needed, so it didn't end up in landfill, so it wasn't emitting methane. And then they would take that based on the chemistry. They could be like, this is best for this type of farmer. And that was like, in so many ways, a way to not only encourage agriculture, but decrease emissions. And maybe one day when I retire, I will go work for them in Chile, because it was just an amazing place.
Good.
Well,
so there are lots of different technologies out there. It's not necessarily all hard tech. There's a lot of chemistry advancements.
I didn't even realize. I'm huge. I mean, San Francisco, I live in San Francisco. We've had municipal composting for, 25 years, I think. And I didn't realize that. And I always looked at it as, oh, that's where I get all my wine from, is that this, our municipal, that waste stream is composted, but I didn't have any idea that the inputs for composting could have
Inputs could affect the outputs.
outputs. I just thought it was all like, hey, it's all black gold, go. Not that you would have
I can't speak to California's compost. I do not know. I can only speak to this one example, but I am sure it is replicable.
Yeah, that's so awesome.
Very good.
Thank you.
So, by the way, Keri, we've hit 2:00 and you have to finish. I have to, by the way, I'm in a hotel here at my 50th high school reunion, by the way, which was a lot of fun last night. So a lot of people I haven't seen in literally in 50 years. But I have to check out too right now. And I know you have to go. So, but I want to thank you so much. We've really just had a chance to touch on these things. I, again, encourage everyone to go to the links for Prime Coalition and Project Frame to learn more. And also you can sign up for like the newsletter from Project Frame. And there are these community meetings where you can listen to more detail, and they'll give you examples of particular companies and case studies that you'll find really interesting. So there's a lot more. This is just the tip of the iceberg here, to use a climate metaphor that probably overused at times. And but I thought this was a great high-level introduction, and we covered some interesting topics. Each one we could spend an hour on, but we won't. So I want to thank you, Keri. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to Stacy, and thanks to everyone who's listening. And we will see you next time. Please subscribe, like, hit the notification bell, do all those things. Follow us on Twitter, X, Blue Sky, and of course on YouTube. And Sundays at 10 a.m. are when we have our new programs, and they're available afterwards forever, and you can watch them later as well. So Keri, thanks again. Really enjoyed the conversation. All right, and goodbye to everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.